For 31 years, she had no name. She was found on a cold March morning in 1988 by a man walking his dog along Sawmill Creek in the Blue Ridge foothills of Western Virginia. A young woman, somewhere between 18 and 25, who had been in the water a long time. She carried no purse, no wallet, no ring. No one in the county recognized her. No missing persons report ever matched. So the county gave her the only name it had to give. On her case file, and later on a small granite marker in the Mercer Gap Cemetery, they carved 2 words: Sawmill Jane. That is not a story about a stranger who washed up in a creek and belonged to no one. That is a story about a young woman who belonged to a great many people, 200 miles away, who never stopped looking for her, and about the man who made sure she'd be hard to find. And it would take 31 years, a forensic artist, and a few cells of DNA pulled from a tooth, to finally give Sawmill Jane back her name, and then to take away the freedom of the man who took her life. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to that cold creek in 1988. Because to understand what was solved, you first have to understand what was lost. Mercer Gap in 1988 was a fading mill town tucked in a fold of the Blue Ridge, maybe 800 people, a furniture factory that was already laying men off, a diner, a hardware store, and 2 churches that competed gently for the same families. The mountains came down close on every side, and the fog sat in the hollows till mid-morning. It was the kind of place where a strange car got noticed and a strange face got remembered, which made it all the harder to understand how a young woman could turn up dead in Sawmill Creek and match no one for 31 years. People kept their doors unlocked and their business quiet. Everyone knew everyone, and not one of them knew her. But somebody did. 200 miles east, in a working-class stretch of Tidewater, Virginia, a family named Okonkwo had been looking for their daughter since the previous fall. Her name was Adayeze, Ada to everyone who loved her. She was 20 years old. She'd been the bright one, the one with the loud laugh, studying to be a dental hygienist at a community college, working weekends at a department store perfume counter. She had a little sister who worshipped her and a mother who called her every Sunday. In the fall of 1987, she'd met a charming older man who drove a nice car and talked about a job in the mountains. And against her family's worry, she'd gone west with him to try something new. The Sunday calls came less often, then stopped. By Christmas, the family had filed a report. But Ada was 20, an adult who had left of her own will with a man, and in 1987 that report went into a drawer and effectively nowhere. 200 miles of Virginia sat between a family searching in the east and a body waiting in the west, and nothing in 1988 connected them. She had one habit her little sister never forgot. Ada painted her nails a particular deep plum every single Sunday night, sitting on the bathroom floor, because she said a hygienist's hands had to look like they cared. The little sister used to watch. She'd remember those plum nails for 31 years. The first to find her was the man with the dog on the 11th of March. He saw her at the water's edge below the old sawmill dam and ran for the hardware store phone. The county had no homicide unit to speak of. The case fell to a sheriff's investigator named Hollis Barrett, 44, a deliberate, soft-spoken man who'd grown up in the Gap and kept a thermos of his wife's coffee on the dash of his county sedan. He stood over Sawmill Jane that gray morning and felt the day go heavy, because he knew already this was a hard one. She'd been in the creek through the winter. There was no identification, no clothing that helped, nothing the methods of 1988 could turn into a name. What the medical examiner could say was this: she had not drowned by accident. There was an old, healed break in her left forearm and dental work that was distinctive. And, the examiner noted, her fingernails, though long submerged, still carried faint traces of a dark lacquer. That detail went into the file and meant nothing to anyone in Mercer Gap. 200 miles away, it would have meant everything. Hollis Barrett did the right things with what little he had. He sent her dental chart and a description to the state and to surrounding counties. He kept her file open as a homicide. There was one lead, early, that seemed for a few weeks like it might break the whole thing open. A family 3 counties north had a daughter who'd been missing since the previous summer. The right age, the right build, and for a tense month, Barrett let himself believe Sawmill Jane finally had a name. He drove the family down. He sat with them in the hallway outside the medical examiner's office. But the dental charts didn't match, and the missing daughter turned up that autumn, alive, in Roanoke. The false hope cost more than time. It taught the surrounding counties that the Mercer Gap Jane Doe had been looked into, and quietly, wrongly, the urgency drained out of the search. But this was 1988. No national database that ordinary investigators could search. No way to broadcast a dental chart beyond a stack of mailed photocopies that mostly went unread. The description of an unidentified young woman in a creek in the far western mountains never crossed the desk of anyone working a missing persons report in Tidewater. The two halves of the same tragedy sat 200 miles apart and never touched. And here is the institutional failure that would haunt it. Because she was a Jane Doe, no name, no grieving local family standing in the sheriff's office every week, the case had no one to push it. A victim with a name generates pressure. A Jane Doe generates a folder. Within a year, Sawmill Jane's homicide file moved to the bottom of the stack, not because anyone stopped caring, but because there was no thread to pull and no one demanding they pull it. The man who had put her in that creek had understood that perfectly. A body with no name is a body with no avenger. While the file went cold in the west, the Okonkwo's lived a different agony in the east. They didn't have a body to grieve. They had a silence. Ada's mother kept her bedroom exactly as it was. Her father wrote letters to the man Ada had left with, to addresses that turned out to be false. Her little sister grew up in a house organized around an absence, around a phone that they prayed would ring on a Sunday night. They were told, in the gentle and devastating way families are told, that grown women sometimes choose to disappear, and that maybe Ada just didn't want to be found. They never believed it. But not believing it changed nothing, because they had no idea where to look, and the one place she actually was had given her another name and buried it. Then the case went cold in both directions at once, not slowly. It froze the moment she was lowered into the Mercer Gap Cemetery, under a stone that read, Sawmill Jane, known but to God, paid for by a collection the town took up because nobody could bear to bury her with nothing at all. By 1995, 7 years had passed. Hollis Barrett kept her photograph, the reconstruction artist's sketch the state had done, pinned inside his desk drawer, where he'd see it every time he reached for a pen. The town visited her grave on Decoration Day, along with their own dead, and somebody always left flowers because she was theirs now, the girl who belonged to no one and so belonged to everyone. By 2003, the furniture factory had closed for good, and half of Mercer Gap had moved away. The diner where the man with the dog had made his call was boarded up. The hardware store had become a thrift shop. But every Decoration Day, somebody still set flowers on the Sawmill Jane stone. And for years, no one knew who, until it came out that it was the daughter of the man who'd found her. A girl who'd been 10 in 1988 and was raising children of her own now, and who said she just couldn't stand the thought of a grave nobody claimed. Hollis Barrett retired, and on his last day he made a copy of the Sawmill Jane file and took it home, because he could not stand the thought of her becoming a box in a basement. In Tidewater, Ada's father died in 2006, still writing the occasional letter into the void. Her little sister, Ngozi, all grown up now, a nurse, promised him at his bedside that she would not let Ada be forgotten. She didn't yet know that keeping that promise would mean a DNA swab and a database that hadn't been invented when her sister disappeared. The two halves of the story stayed 200 miles apart for 3 more decades. A town in the mountains tending a nameless grave. A family on the coast tending a nameless grief. Neither knowing the other existed. Every case we cover on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, court files, and the lives of people who deserve to be remembered. If you want us to keep telling these stories the way they ought to be told, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It honestly is what keeps this channel going. Now, let's get back to Ada. The case had been cold for 31 years, when 2 efforts that had never heard of each other finally reached toward the middle. In 2019, a state cold case unit began exhuming and retesting the Commonwealth's unidentified remains using methods that did not exist in 1988. Sawmill Jane was among them. A forensic odontologist confirmed the old dental work. A lab pulled a usable DNA profile from a tooth. The hard enamel had protected it for 3 decades in the ground. And a forensic genealogist began the patient work of building a family tree from distant relatives who had uploaded their own DNA to public ancestry websites. Here is the technology in plain terms. Forensic genetic genealogy takes a DNA profile from unidentified remains and runs it against the same public ancestry databases where ordinary people search for cousins and grandparents. The computer finds distant relatives of the unknown person, and a genealogist works inward down the branches of the family tree until they arrive at a single name. It is the same tool that has put names to hundreds of Jane and John Does who waited decades in numbered graves. In the same window, 200 miles east, Ngozi Okonkwo, keeping the promise she'd made her dying father, had done the one new thing available to her. She had mailed her own saliva to a consumer DNA service and checked, every few months, the box that let law enforcement compare her profile to unidentified remains. For years, nothing. Then, on an ordinary Wednesday, a genealogist named Dana Whitfield, working Sawmill Jane's tree in a state lab office, watched the branches narrow through second cousins and then first cousins toward a single candidate family in Tidewater, Virginia. She had done this enough times to know the feeling in the last hour, when a tree that has been a thicket of strangers for weeks suddenly snaps into a shape. And there, flagged in the system, was a living woman who had opted in, whose DNA said, plainly and without question, that she was the younger sister of the unknown girl from Sawmill Creek. Dana Whitfield sat back from the screen. She read the name twice, and then a third time, the way you do when a number you've called Sawmill Jane for weeks of late nights abruptly becomes a person with a family still waiting. Then she walked down the hall to her supervisor's office and said the sentence that 31 years of investigators in Mercer Gap had never been able to say. We know who she is. Sawmill Jane had a name. Her name was Adaize Okonkwo. Ngozi was at work, in scrubs, when her phone rang, and a quiet voice from the state police asked if she could sit down. She had waited her whole adult life for the call, and still it knocked the breath out of her. They told her where her sister had been all along, 200 miles west, in a mountain cemetery, under a stone that didn't bear her name, tended by strangers who had loved her without ever knowing who she was. Ngozi drove out to Mercer Gap that weekend and stood at the grave marked Sawmill Jane, and a retired investigator named Hollis Barrett, 75 now, met her there because someone had thought to call him, and he had kept the photograph in his drawer all those years. A name did more than end a family's not knowing. It gave the homicide back its thread. Because once investigators knew who Ada was, they could finally ask the question Mercer Gap never could. Who had brought her to those mountains? The answer was in the Okonkwo's old letters. The charming older man with the nice car and the talk of a job in the mountains. The man Ada had left Tidewater with in the fall of 1987. His name was Gerald Vance Pruitt. Pruitt was 66 now, living 3 counties from Mercer Gap, a retired regional sales manager, a churchgoer, a grandfather who coached a grandson's rec league team. In 1987, he had been a traveling salesman who worked the territory that ran from Tidewater up into the Blue Ridge, a smooth, well-dressed man who could talk a young woman into a new life and a road trip west. He had no record. He had spent 31 years as a respectable man, and he had counted all that time on the fact that the girl he left in Sawmill Creek had no name to lead anyone back to him. He had not been hidden behind a powerful family or a far-off city. He had been hidden behind her anonymity, the one thing he'd engineered, and the one thing modern science finally undid. The state police built the rest carefully. Old motel and gas station records along Pruitt's 1987 sales route placed him in the Mercer Gap area that winter. A box of Ada's belongings her mother had saved held a photograph of Ada with Pruitt, his arm around her, taken weeks before she vanished. A photo no one had ever had a reason to show the Western County. And the healed forearm fracture in the medical examiner's old report matched an injury Ngozi remembered her sister suffering the year before she left, an injury Ada had once said on a tense Sunday call that Gerald had been there for. Confronted with the photograph, the route records, and a sister who could now say her sister's name in an interview room, Gerald Pruitt's calm finally cracked. He admitted he had taken Ada to the mountains, that she had wanted to go home, that they had argued at the creek. He had left her there and driven east and simply continued his life, certain that a body with no name could never reach him. When the news traveled through Mercer Gap, who learned that their Sawmill Jane had been a Tidewater girl named Ada, and through the county where Pruitt had coached and worshipped for decades, the reaction ran the same hard course it always does. Disbelief first, not Gerald, not the grandfather on the ball field. Then, as the photograph and the route records came out, a slow fury, not only at him but at how thoroughly an ordinary, smiling man had used a young woman's anonymity as a place to hide. Gerald Pruitt was charged with murder in 2020. He pleaded guilty in 2021 rather than face a trial where Ngozi would testify, and was sentenced to life in prison. That same year, Ada Okonkwo came home. Her family brought her 200 miles east and buried her beside her father under a headstone that finally bore her own name, her own dates, and the words her sister chose: found. The people of Mercer Gap did not let the moment pass unmarked. They held a small service at the now empty grave by Sawmill Creek, and they left the granite Sawmill Jane marker standing beside the empty plot, with a new line added beneath it. Her name was Ades. She was loved in 2 places now. She was 20 years old. She painted her nails plum every Sunday night because she believed a healer's hands should look like they cared. She had a loud laugh and a little sister who worshipped her, and a future as someone who fixed people's smiles for a living. She trusted the wrong, charming man, the way kind people sometimes do, and it cost her not only her life but, for 31 years, her very name. The investigator who stood over a nameless girl in 1988 lived to learn she was Ada and to stand at her grave beside the sister who'd never given up. The sister who promised a dying father kept that promise with a cheek swab and refused to stop checking a box that said, "Compare me to the unidentified dead." And a mountain town that buried a stranger out of pure decency turned out to have been keeping her safe for the family that was searching all along. It makes you wonder, how many numbered graves and nameless markers are out there right now, in how many small-town cemeteries, holding someone whose family 200 miles away has never stopped lighting a candle? What does it say that the thing standing between a grieving family and the truth was simply a name, and that for 31 years no one could supply it? And how many killers have walked free for decades, not because they were clever, but because they made sure their victim couldn't be identified? Tell us in the comments, do you think more should be done to test the unidentified remains still sitting in evidence and in graves across the country? What detail in this case stayed with you the most? The plum nails, the strangers tending her grave, the sister's swab? And do you believe Ada would ever have been found if Ngozi hadn't kept her father's promise? Justice came for Adaeze Okonkwo after 31 years, and so did her own name. Stories like hers remind us that no one is truly nameless, that someone, somewhere, is always still looking, and that being known, being found, being called by your real name at last, is its own form of justice. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description. Thank you for watching.